Can I say something that's going to sound insane for the first 10 seconds, and then never leave your head again? Being a good person has almost nothing to do with whether your life goes well. I know how that sounds, but stay with me, because I'm not the one saying it. A guy who got tortured, stripped of everything he owned, and exiled to a farm, said it 500 years ago, and he was right, and it's still ruining people's lives today, because nobody wants to hear it. Your parents told you the world is basically fair. Be kind, work hard, and it works out. Church told you virtue gets its reward eventually. If not here, then somewhere. Every Instagram caption you've ever scrolled past told you that if you just want it badly enough, the universe conspires to hand it to you. Here's the guy who called all three of those a comforting lie, Niccolò Machiavelli. And by the time I'm done telling you about him, over coffee, no rush, you're going to look at your last breakup differently, your last job loss differently, that friend who got lucky while you worked twice as hard differently. Because Machiavelli didn't write a theory about politics. He wrote a theory about why life hands out outcomes the way it does, and it's not the way we were promised. Here's the twist that makes this actually worth your coffee. The guy who figured this out wasn't some detached philosopher in a library. He lived it first. The theory came after his life fell apart, not before. Like he had to lose everything before he could finally see clearly what everyone else was too comfortable to notice. Picture Florence, 1500s. Basically the Silicon Valley of political intrigue. Except instead of startups burning cash, city-states burned alliances. And instead of getting fired, you sometimes got imprisoned. Machiavelli spent 14 years inside that machine as a diplomat, sitting across the table from kings, popes, mercenary warlords, the founders and heads of state of his day. And he noticed something uncomfortable. The leaders who talked the most about honor and virtue weren't usually the ones still standing in 5 years. The ones who lasted were the ones who read the room accurately and moved without sentiment. Then the political wind flipped. The family he'd worked against came back into power, and Machiavelli got arrested, tortured on a device that dislocates your shoulders, and dumped on a farm outside the city with nothing, no job, no title, no audience. That's usually where a story like this ends. Forgotten guy, forgotten farm, forgotten name. Except stuck out there with literally nothing left to lose. He did the only thing he knew how to do. He kept observing. Except now the specimen under the microscope was his own collapse. And from that farmhouse he wrote The Prince. People have spent 5 centuries arguing about whether that book is a cynical how-to guide for tyrants or something else completely. But before we get into what it actually says, here's the thing you need to sit with. Everything that destroyed Machiavelli's life was exactly what he'd spent his whole career studying in other people. He wasn't theorizing about betrayal and downfall from a safe distance. It had just happened to him. He wrote it while the bruises were basically still there. Here's twist number 1, and it's a gut punch. Exile didn't end Machiavelli's career. Exile was the career. Everything before it was just the warm-up. But before we get to what he built out of the wreckage, we need to torch something first. A belief so baked into modern life that nobody questions it anymore. That motivation and good intentions are the main engine of success. Machiavelli would laugh at that over this coffee with us. Not because ambition is worthless, but because everyone has it. Every founder whose startup went bankrupt wanted it to work. Every ex who burned you meant well on day one. Wanting something has never been the rare ingredient. Seeing reality accurately is the rare ingredient. This is his first big reframe. People aren't primarily driven by ideals or morals. They're driven by self-interest, not as a character flaw, more like gravity. Nobody gets mad at gravity for pulling things down. You just build around it. Machiavelli's whole point is that most of us never build around self-interest the same way. We keep expecting people to override it out of loyalty or love, and then act shocked when reality wins. Think about the coworker who threw you under the bus in that meeting to protect their own numbers, or the friend who ghosted you the second you couldn't be useful to their career anymore. In their own head, they weren't the villain. They were just protecting themselves, the same way you would. Once you stop expecting people to sacrifice their own interest for you, betrayal stops feeling personal and starts looking like weather. That's the deeper twist here. Good people don't always win, not because the universe is unjust, but because good was never actually the variable in play. Accurate perception was. The people who keep winning aren't necessarily the most virtuous. They're the ones reading the actual board in front of them, instead of the board they wish they were playing on. This terrified people in his own time, because it removed the comforting idea that the universe keeps a moral scoreboard. It suggested something colder. There is no scoreboard. There's just accurate action getting rewarded, and inaccurate action getting punished, over and over, with no regard for who deserved what. And that sets up the next question, the one that actually built his whole worldview. If good intentions don't decide your fate, what does? He had an answer. Two invisible forces, locked in a permanent tug of war, and understanding the difference between them might be the single most useful thing you take from this conversation. Here's where it gets genuinely useful. So lean in. Machiavelli split human life into two forces. One you'll never control. The other is entirely yours. The uncontrollable one he called fortuna, luck, timing, the layoff nobody saw coming, the recession that torches your industry, the diagnosis, the accident. Fortuna doesn't care about your effort or your character. It just happens, the same way weather just happens. The one you can control, he called virtue, and this trips people up, because it has nothing to do with virtue, the way we use the word today. Virtue means capability, skill, discipline, the trained ability to act decisively, no matter what shows up. It's the half of life that's entirely, permanently yours. Machiavelli figured fortuna controls roughly half of what happens to you, and virtù controls the other half. Specifically, how well you respond to whatever fortuna throws at you. You can't stop the storm. You can absolutely build a boat that survives it. Sit with that for a second, because it's the first real payoff of this whole conversation. You were never supposed to control your life. You were only ever supposed to control who you become in response to it. Think about it like this. Two people get laid off from the same company, same week, same severance package. One of them spirals for 6 months. The other had already been quietly building a network, a second skill, savings. Not because they predicted the layoff, but because they'd built virtue before fortuna showed up uninvited. Same storm, wildly different boats. Most of us build backwards. We wait for stability before we build discipline. We wait for the right conditions before we build the skill that would actually let us survive instability. Machiavelli's whole argument is that this order gets people killed, professionally and otherwise. Virtue has to exist before fortuna arrives, because fortuna never sends a calendar invite. Ever notice how some people seem to get lucky over and over? Look closer, and it's rarely magic. They'd already built the capability to recognize an opening the second it appeared. Meanwhile, someone standing right next to them handed the exact same opening, let it slide past, because they hadn't built the muscle to act on it. This also lets you off the hook a little, and then puts you right back on it. If fortuna is half the equation, Some of your worst moments were never a verdict on your worth. The dice just landed badly. But if virtue is the other half, how you respond, rebuild, and adapt is entirely on you, no excuses. His own exile proves the theory. Fortuna took his job, his safety, his status, in months, through events he never chose. But it couldn't touch his virtue. His ability to observe and write stayed completely his. That's exactly what he used to rebuild something Fortuna could never take back. Here's a twist that stings a little, so brace yourself. You've probably spent years assuming that if you're good on the inside, that goodness eventually gets recognized. Machiavelli would gently tell you that's backwards. Almost nobody has access to what's actually inside you. What they have access to is what you look like from the outside, and they make every decision about you based on that, long before they ever get close enough to see the real thing. He put it almost exactly like this: everybody sees what you appear to be, and only a few ever actually experience what you really are, and those few don't dare go against the opinion of the many. Appearance isn't a shallow distraction from reality. For almost everyone you'll ever deal with, appearance is the only reality they have access to. Think about how this plays out today. Two people apply for the same promotion with identical output. One of them is quietly excellent and says nothing about it. The other is competent and visible, updates their manager, shows up polished, speaks up in the room. Unfair as it feels, the second person usually gets picked, not because their work is better, but because their work is the only work anyone actually saw. Same thing with a first date, a job interview, even a first impression at a new gym. Nobody's evaluating your soul. They're evaluating the 90 seconds of evidence you gave them. This isn't Machiavelli telling you to fake anything. It's him telling you that neglecting how you're perceived, on the theory that the truth will come out eventually, is one of the most expensive mistakes a capable person can make. Reputation isn't vanity. It's currency. It opens doors before people have any real evidence you deserve to walk through them. And it closes doors just as fast when it's damaged, regardless of whether the damage was fair. And here's the part that connects back to everything we just talked about. Reputation is actually downstream of virtue, not separate from it. The discipline and capability you build in private eventually becomes visible, whether you're managing it consciously or not. The mistake isn't caring about perception. It's assuming perception will take care of itself. It won't. It has to be built the same way everything else worth having gets built, on purpose. Every hustle culture post you've ever scrolled past makes the same promise: grind now, relax later. Struggle is the toll, comfort is the destination. Machiavelli takes that entire premise and flips it upside down on us. Comfort isn't the reward waiting at the end of the struggle. Comfort is where the decline quietly begins. Think about a muscle you stop using. It doesn't stay the same size out of loyalty to your past workouts. It shrinks, because the body only maintains what it's asked to maintain. Machiavelli says the same thing happens to your judgment, your discipline, your instincts. Necessity is what builds them. The second necessity disappears, so does the training. Whether we're talking about a person, a company, or an empire, you've watched this happen. The employee who stops learning new skills the moment the promotion lands, because the pressure that built their ambition is gone. The couple who stop actually talking to each other once the relationship feels secure, and then wonder, 5 years later, why it feels hollow. The startup that gets comfortable after the first big funding round and gets eaten by a scrappier competitor 2 years later who was still hungry. In every case, comfort didn't reward the work that got them there. It quietly disarmed it. Machiavelli didn't just apply this to individuals. He pointed at the biggest example available to him: Rome. Rome didn't collapse because it ran out of soldiers or money. At its peak, it had more resources than any civilization before it. It collapsed because generations of dominance removed the necessity that had built the empire in the first place. People raised without real existential threat gradually lost the discipline, the administrative rigor, the willingness to sacrifice that had produced their own greatness. Nothing dramatic, no single villain. Just slow rust on a structure nobody was maintaining anymore, because nobody had to. Sound familiar? It's the same story as the company that dominates its market for a decade, stops innovating because it doesn't have to, and then gets blindsided by a competitor building in a garage with nothing to lose. It's the athlete who wins the championship, gets comfortable, and never wins another one. Same mechanism, different century. This is the part where the stakes stop being about one guy's career and start being about entire civilizations. Difficulty was never the obstacle standing between you and the good life. Difficulty is the actual mechanism that builds the capability required to sustain one. Remove it completely, and you don't get paradise. You get fragility, wearing paradise's outfit. If comfort is the quiet killer, necessity is the hidden teacher nobody thanks. Machiavelli noticed something across every ruler, every rise, every collapse he studied. The people who achieved anything lasting were almost never handed the smoothest path. They were placed under pressure, severe enough that they had no choice but to adapt. Necessity doesn't ask if you're ready, it just demands a response, and that demand is exactly what carves out character comfort never could. Think about the person who only started actually taking care of their health after a scary diagnosis, or the person who only built real financial discipline after going broke once. Nobody chooses those moments, but the pressure is what does the building that a decade of comfortable good intentions never managed to do. This isn't Machiavelli glorifying suffering for its own sake. It's narrower than that, since necessity shows up whether you invite it or not. The smart move is treating it as raw material instead of a personal injustice. The person who's never been tested has no real idea what they're capable of, and neither does anyone counting on them. His own exile is the clearest proof he could offer. He didn't choose the torture or the isolation, but necessity, having literally nothing left to lose, is what pushed him to write. If his old comfortable life had just continued, The Prince almost certainly never gets written. The exact rupture that seemed to end him is what made him immortal. Here's the reversal that changes how you read everything that came before it. For 500 years, The Prince has been read as a manual for rulers, how to seize territory, manage rivals, hold power. And sure, on the surface, that's what's happening. Dukes, armies, treaties. But peel off the costume, and it's not really a manual for running a country. It's a manual for navigating a world that doesn't automatically reward good intentions, which means it applies just as directly to you negotiating a layoff, a betrayal, a divorce, a failed business, as it did to some 16th century duke defending a border. Swap territory for career. Swap rivals for competitors, or that coworker gunning for your job. Swap the state for the life you're actually trying to build. The advice barely changes. Read situations accurately, because people judge you on appearances before they ever find out the truth. Prepare for chaos instead of assuming stability, because Fortuna never checks your calendar first. Build capability before you need it, because necessity always shows up on its own schedule, never yours. That's why this book outlasted every government it was originally written about. It was never really a 16th century Italian politics manual. It was a survival document wearing one as a disguise. So, let's go back to where we started. That small farmhouse outside Florence. A man who'd lost everything a person can lose. Power, status, income, reputation. Even his own body still carried the marks of what had been taken from him. By every normal measure, that's where his story should have ended. Forgotten diplomat, forgotten farm. Another casualty of shifting political weather. Instead, with nothing left to protect and no audience left to perform for, he wrote the most honest account of human nature and power ever produced. Not despite the collapse, but because of it. The men who exiled him, who tortured him, who erased him from public life? Footnotes now, mostly remembered because they happened to cross his path. He outlasted every one of them, not by getting his old life back, but by becoming something Fortuna could never touch again. And that's the real ending, the part that actually matters for you and me, sitting here with our coffee going cold. His deepest lesson was never really about manipulation or scheming. That's the surface reading, the one that got the book banned in half of Europe. The real lesson is underneath. Life is, at some point, going to take almost everything from you. Your position, your comfort, your certainty, maybe even your name in the room. None of that was ever fully yours to protect, and no amount of good intentions will stop it from being taken. What stays yours is virtue, the discipline, the perception, the capability you built before you needed it, and the willingness to rebuild with whatever's left once Fortuna's taken its cut. Machiavelli never got his old life back. He built a completely new one, out of a farmhouse and a pen, out of nothing but what he'd trained himself to become. And that's the whole thing. Boiled down to one sentence, you can actually take with you when you leave this table. You can't control what life takes from you. You can only control who you've become by the time it does.